She stood at the top of the wagon like a tired mule, head shrouded in a coarse burlap sack, feet bare and bleeding into the wood, hands tied like a felon. And they laughed around her, bidding like it was a damn circus. $1, bellowed a fat man, his voice heavy with cruelty. A real savage. Yours forever. The crowd exploded. Burnt-necked old men and grinning, whiskey-stained faces. Dusty-booted young men with nothing in their eyes. Caleb Morgan stood at the periphery of it. His heart pounded like the thunder of distant cannon. He'd witnessed terror before. At Gettysburg, in the mire, in the eyes of dying boys. But this was entertainment wrapped in evil. He should have looked away. That's what men like him were trained to do. Keep your head down, watch the world decay. But then, she faltered. Once, her legs collapsed under the load of shame. And in that instant, something within Caleb broke. $1, he said softly, level, unshakable. Laughter ceased. There was a silence that hit like a hammer. The seller snarled. Sold. To the solitary farmer. He spat. Caleb mounted the wagon, sliced through the ropes, and yanked the sack off of her head. He had anticipated a victim, a shell of a girl. What he was greeted with instead was fire. Her eyes blazed like embers. Her shoulders were set. Not broken. Not cowering. That expression would give him nightmares for the duration of his life. He didn't know her name, didn't know her history, but the second his hands brushed against that rope, he knew. He hadn't just purchased a woman, he'd entered a war, one he wasn't prepared for. Caleb remained silent during the ride home, not because of mystery, but simply because words weren't an option. He'd been alone for 7 years, since Mary died. Silence was a friend. There were days he even liked it, but now he had someone. Not just anyone. A woman who hadn't spoken since he cut her loose. She didn't weep, didn't beg, didn't appear scared. She shot behind his horse, barefoot and quiet, like she didn't belong to anyone. The sun was low by the time they arrived at the ranch. The ranch seemed smaller than he'd remembered, almost ashamed, and perhaps even he was. He indicated the ancient barn and said, "You can stay there. There's cotton. Water." She didn't nod, didn't talk, just stared. That evening, Caleb couldn't sleep. The quiet had altered. It wasn't quiet anymore. It had a beat, presence. By morning, he left some food and coffee on the porch. He didn't notice her take it, but the plate was spotless by noon. 3 days went by. Neither said anything, but things began to change. One morning, the gate latch was mended, better than he'd ever done it himself. Another day, he discovered his ripped shirt stitched up tight like it had been bought at the general store. He started to converse. Not to her, just to the air. About the cows, the weather, the dull throb in his knee. She never responded, but he knew she was hearing. He could sense it. Then the storm arrived. A big one. Clouds charged like stampeding herd, dark and vicious. The wind screamed like something that was dying. Caleb ran to the barn to look at the cattle, and there she was, standing in the doorway, watching the sky as though it were something she'd battled before. "Get in!" he yelled. She didn't budge. Not until the lightning split, close and loud. Caleb took her by the arm, pulled her through the rain, and slammed the cabin door closed behind them. They stood there, dripping wet, panting. And for the first time, he saw it. Fear. Not the cold silence she hid behind like armor. Genuine fear. And in that instant, she wasn't a mystery. Wasn't a warrior. She was simply a woman. Vulnerable. Human. Something changed between them after that storm. Not through words. Not through vows. But through presence. Every morning, Caleb placed a plate of cornbread and coffee on the porch. He never saw her eat it. But by mid-morning, it was always gone. Later, she started sitting on the edge of the steps. Not near, but not hiding anymore either. Then one morning he noticed. An old saddle he'd lost weeks before, set out primly on the porch rail. And next to it, sketched gently into the dust, one flower. That evening, he uncovered one of Mary's old botany books. Page 47. There it was. Anna. prairie flower. In Comanche, it meant forever blooming. The following morning, he whispered it when he put the plate down. Ayana. She didn't wince, didn't say anything. But from that day forward, he kept on saying it. With each, her gaze stayed just a fraction longer. And then, on one still morning, she said his name. Caleb. Only one word, soft, steady, but it brought him up short. Years of silence. Then to hear his name pronounced in another voice was like music he'd never realized he'd forgotten. They didn't say much. Didn't have to. They began to restore the ranch together. Her silent beauty infused the kitchen, while his steady hands worked the earth. At night, he read to her, by firelight, stumbling over yellowed pages. Sometimes she smiled when he mispronounced a word. And there, in the silence, they started making something real, something slow, something true. One night, as Caleb was sharpening a hoe outside the barn, Ayana came up beside him. She laid her hand over his, spoke nothing. She didn't need to. It was the first time Caleb didn't feel like a man who was barely hanging on. If he had any idea what was waiting for him, he might have been sharpening a rifle instead of a hoe. But that's what about peace, you never know how much you needed it, until it's about to be taken away. If you've hung in here this long, perhaps, just maybe, you're the type of spirit who still believes in tales like theirs. And if that's the case, go on, hit that subscribe button. Because out here in the West, there are still more stories to be told. Word gets around quick in a small town, particularly when the people gossiping had too much time and not quite enough sense. In Rob Bend, back when Caleb and the Comanche woman story had spread like fire. To some, it was scandal. To others, a joke cruel. But to Garrett Sloan, personal. You see, Garrett was the one who introduced Ayana into town in the first place. He figured she'd be out in no time. A sale, a drink, and he was good to go. But some mousy little widower made him appear a fool. And Garrett Sloan didn't remember being humiliated in public gladly. He didn't scream, didn't threaten. He just seethed like rotten meat until he was looking for trouble. One afternoon Caleb spotted the storm on the horizon. Not in the clouds, but in the dust cloud on the horizon. For horsemen, quick, boisterous, indignant. He tossed aside the fence post he'd been repairing and yelled quietly, Ayana, go inside. Lock the door. She glanced up from her garden, saw the threat, and slipped wordlessly into the cabin. The riders didn't abate, didn't knock. They rode bold, half-faced, Garrett at their lead. Afternoon, Vance, he sneered, mangling Caleb's name. Heard you're playing house with stolen property. Caleb didn't yell, didn't blink. She isn't stolen, he answered. She's my wife. Not a legal fact, perhaps, but the sort that existed in bone and blood and soul. Garrett jeered, harsh and cruel. You think that makes a difference? She's property of the town. We bought her once. We'll take her back now. He climbed down, hand wandering toward his belt. But Caleb's rifle was already raised, steady, calm. She's not leaving, he said. You can go, or learn just how serious I am. For an instant, nobody moved. Only the rustle of wind through the tall grass. Then the creaking of the cabin door. Ayana emerged, not with a gun, not with fear, but in the blue calico shawl Caleb had once left behind for her. She strode to his side, head held high. She didn't require a weapon. She was one. That single action, standing there with him, spoke louder than any bullet could have. Garrett glanced between them, and what he saw was not fear, was not doubt. He saw two individuals who had endured too much to be intimidated by drunks and cowards. He grumbled something under his breath, stepped back. The others didn't protest. They weren't seeking a war, just a scare. And they'd failed. By the time their dust had vanished over the ridge, Caleb had still not lowered his rifle. He glanced at Ayana, nodded. That evening they said little. They didn't need to. The threat had passed. But something else took its place. Peace. Not the temporary one that creeps in on still nights. The kind you fight for. The kind you earn. And this one remained. Seasons passed. So did the ranch. So did they. Ayana's garden ran wild, flowering as if it knew it was protected. Caleb's hands became harder, but more solid. Both of them created a life, not from what they'd lost, but from what they'd not given up. Love, perhaps, but something greater, trust. Because that's what the West was truly about. Not shootouts or gold. Not saloons or herds. But the determination it takes to rebuild. To remain. To love once more. Even when you are afraid. Perhaps you're sitting here watching this right now thinking about your own battle. Perhaps you lost someone. Perhaps your own Garrett Sloan rode up onto your path one day. So ask yourself, what did you fight for when the going got tough? What stopped you from quitting? And more than that, who stood with you? If this tale roused something within you, if it made you remember, or think, or just feel something true, hit the like button. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that bear dust and hope and flame, subscribe. Because out here, in the wind and stillness of the West, every now and then, someone makes their way home. And when they do, you'll want to hear about it.